Thank you. I'm going to pull this because I tend to wander some. So good to be with you. Good to see some familiar faces. Hey, George. So we are in week 2 of thinking about theologies and ethics of creation care. And I wanted to begin with just a few reminders from our conversation from last week. Or for those who weren't able to be here last week, some fresh takes on things. So last week, as we started to think about theologies of creation care, I noted at that time that there's kind of been several dominant streams of thinking about how to do creation care. Eco-justice, creation spirituality. Stewardship is the one that usually sits closest to the way that most Reformed and Protestant people think. And if it feels familiar to you, that's why. And so I wanted to suggest last week, or one thing I wanted to suggest last week, is that stewardship tends to be our starting point, and with good reasons, because stewardship actually does really pay attention to thinking about creation care in important ways. I did note at the time that it's not that stewardship is non-problematic, right? That there are limits, constraints, there are imperfections about thinking about stewardship, one of which is what it tends to mean is that our focus of attention is on how to be obedient to God more than directly kind of thinking about how to engage creation. We get attention to creation care mediated through attention to God, which also makes sense to a lot of us who are Protestant, but that's not the only way we're doing things, partly because it signals a differentiation between kind of God and creation that sometimes can be exacerbated in the way that we think about how we relate to God as creatures. So toward addressing some of those imperfections and incompletions of stewardship language and thinking about creation care, we suggested last week that the coherence of a theology of stewardship relies on a religious vision of the world in which there are 3 elements. The first is that created stuff matters, that we take seriously when God creates things and calls them good, and then says, you have a responsibility, you human beings, for caring for this creation, right? So that creation matters is the first kind of quality of stewardship language that's important. The second is that to be a steward is to claim that we do not own, although we have responsibilities for things, right? This is the classic understanding of what a steward is. The steward is the person who gets put in charge by the owner of caring for stuff without actually owning that stuff. And then the third quality for kind of effective ways of thinking about stewardship in the context of creation care is that nature, the natural world, become a means of making sense of divine care and attention. The reason we do stewardship, the reason we do creation care isn't simply because God told us to do so. It's because God told us to do so because God recognizes and God shaped a world in which we are a part of that system, in which we can make sense of how God acts as a generous giver, as someone that works out of abundance for the benefit not only of us, but for the rest of creation as well. So these are kind of 3 big claims that tend to sit behind Protestant/Reform/Presbyterian ways of emphasizing stewardship, of getting at creation care. And toward that end, I suggested toward the end of last week that part of what this would mean for us in the 21st century would be that we wanted to think about human beings not as the centerpiece of creation, but as partners in doing the work of creation care. That we have particular responsibilities and vocations, but we're not the only creatures, actually, that God gives responsibilities and vocations to. One reason for that, or one implication for that, is that when we're engaging in creation care, we're not paying attention to specific individuals or species. We're paying attention to ecosystems, because ecosystems, the interaction of different species, help maintain stability and promote flourishing. So stewardship doesn't look like just pay attention to this species or to this project or to what this particular church is doing. It looks like paying attention to the wider ecosystems within which species and projects and churches function. We also noted that then within a vision of stewardship, not only is stuff good, are creatures good, but the rest of creation and the rest of creatures in these ecosystems have their distinct vocations. The ready example that we used last week is to note, for instance, that unless we really want to change our jobs, none of us is going to become pollinators. We rely on insects to pollinate, bees to pollinate. So, and yet we need pollination to happen for the production of crops, which then become the food that we eat. So bees play a special role in our ecosystem relationship in creating and being pollinators to make it possible for us to enjoy the fruits of crops, to enjoy the fruits of fruits, for that matter. And in ecosystems, you pay attention to the way, as environmental scientists will note, you pay attention to the way that different species interact with each other towards stability and flourishing. Which is to say then that within the context of stewardship, when we're thinking about how to be good stewards in the context of creation care, we have to understand that flourishing happens collectively or not at all. When we eliminate vital species, we make it harder for other species to thrive. When we remove resources that are necessary for some species to thrive, it impacts other species along the way. Whether it's happening in big places like Yellowstone or local places like the property, the campus of Trinity Presbyterian Church, we'd want to pay attention then to kind of the system, not just to a single thing along the way. So those are some big ideas that we wanted to we played out last week. And I wanted to take a breath for a moment, and for those who were here last week, or maybe if you have new questions, to give you a moment to ask questions or to give any reflections from last week's stuff before we launch into this week's stuff. And I can wander around with this mic and hand it off to people if you have questions. I see a hand. Yeah.
I'm asking with a dim memory of one series of approaches to ecology and ecological stewardship, one of them having more to do with redemption, others like this, and that made me curious. Maybe you could repeat those three if you know what I'm talking about, but is one of the approaches you named last week more subject to say moving toward pantheism, do any of them specifically imply more like panentheism? And it's a little technical, but I guess most people know we've got one of the challenges is, are we worshiping trees? Are we hugging trees? Are we acknowledging trees as signs of a distinct creator? Can you say anything more about that?
Sure, and probably define a bunch of terms that you threw out, pantheism and panentheism. Okay, so last week what I suggested, and I'm building here out of work by colleagues like Laurel Kearns, who teaches up at Drew, and Willis Jenkins, who teaches at the University of Virginia, that there have been kind of these three broad ways of thinking about creation care. The first way is sometimes called eco-justice. Eco-justice is a way of thinking about creation care that Christians have tended to think of in terms of, to align with ideas of sanctification, of promoting systems that bring about holiness by partnering with God in that work. That tends to be a way that, for instance, Roman Catholicism has done creation care. You can find it in Laudato Si, the big volume, the encyclical that was produced by Pope Francis about 8-9 years ago. So that's one way. The stewardship is a second way that we've kind of named. It tends to be more thinking about kind of redemptive work in which we're recognizing a problem and attempting to address it. And then there's a third way, which is a creation spirituality, which tends to get more associated with Orthodox churches, Eastern Orthodox churches. And there, rather than sanctification or justification and redemption, is a language of kind of deification. That is, to recognize God active in the rest of creation around us. We Protestants get really hesitant about that latter one. We worry a lot about idolatry. We Protestants tend not to do things like Catholics do because we spend a whole lot of time arguing that Catholics are wrong and we're right. That third approach, eco-spirituality, you could find, for instance, pantheism, which is kind of that God is in the trees, in nature, is the natural world. You can also find it differently in something like panentheism, the other big word you threw out, which is that God is in creation, but creation isn't kind of the entirety of how God acts and who God is. That God is also beyond creation. So we Protestants don't do too much of that because we want to kind of recognize that we pay attention to the God that's beyond more than the God that is in, but we do recognize that God reveals God's self in God's creative material. All right. Any other questions? That was a long answer to a thoughtful question. Let's move forward. One of the things I ended with last week is to note that by the time we got to the end of last week and thought about stewardship as kind of a way that Protestants, Presbyterians, have thought about doing creation care, that language that we use is language that's been available and useful for us for generations. But we're entering into interestingly complex new times. And so I wanted to ask the question today, to continue to think today about how might we think about stewardship in light of the changing times that we're dealing with. And those changing times I'm thinking of in two particular ways. The first is the reality of a climate crisis that is unexperienced in human history. And the second is the continued transformation of politics, especially in the United States. So for today, I am going to shift from preaching to meddling a lot more overtly to think about how to engage questions of stewardship in a context of climate change and political dysfunction. So, toward that end, does anybody recognize this image that's sitting behind the words here? So this image is an image of the last century and a half of temperature against average. If white is average temperature, then blue is slightly cooler than average temperature globally, and red is hotter than average temperature. And what you can see in the image is that as we were coming out of the Little Ice Age 150, 200 years ago, we were on the coolish side. We entered into kind of a mean period that if you trace back in longer human history for a couple thousand years, this would be kind of average. But over the past couple of decades, we keep getting hotter. So much so that you have climate scientists saying red is no longer an adequate color to signal just how hot we're getting overall, over time. So this is a visual representation of the changing global temperature over the past 150 years. What we want to recognize is, first of all, then, that that the temperatures are changing, that they have been changing for a much longer period of time, but the change that we're undergoing recently is unmatched in kind of recorded history. So we can go back 2,000 years, and you can see the ups and downs, but over the past 100 years especially, you can see that temperature shoot up. And what climate scientists have known for, well, actually what scientists have known for well over a century is that if you put carbon dioxide into a closed system, you'll get more heat in that system. This is 19th century scientific chemists discovering this stuff. we've been pumping carbon dioxide into the system with the creation of kind of the combustion engine, the internal combustion engine. And increasingly what scientists have been aware of over the past 30 years is that as we've been pumping carbon dioxide into the system, we've been creating a system that gets hotter. Now, to note two things about that. First, carbon dioxide in itself isn't bad. We actually need a certain amount of carbon dioxide in the system. The issue isn't whether or not to have carbon dioxide there, it's the production of and the rate of the increasing amount of carbon dioxide. Second is that we're not entirely bad. We're pretty resilient as creatures at kind of negotiating some temperature changes. We've survived the little ice ages. We survived global, kind of a median global comfortable spot in the Middle Ages. But the more we produce, the harder it gets for all of us. So when climate scientists talk about the dangers of climate change, they're not just signaling an increase in temperature, they're signaling the impacts of an increase on temperature in the flourishing of the systems that we rely on and that we are a part of going forward. So we have a temperature change related to kind of climate chaos, and I'll talk about a little bit more about some of the implications of that. We also want to note over the past 150 years the exponential growth of pollutants in the world, right? That there are pesticides and plasticides and hormones and all types of things going on. And at this point, I may shock you a little bit with this little bit of information. In your body, you are carrying around microplastics that are now a permanent part of your system. Because plastics break down into very small particles, they make their way into the food streams. We eat that food, and then that stuff stays in us. Recent studies are showing it in our brains, right? That's just one of the pollutants we're negotiating in the middle of a lot of others. I have a colleague, a chemist at Georgia State, who says even if you don't worry about carbon dioxide driven by the combustion engine, you ought to worry about the kind of the release of heavy metals into the atmosphere, because we're taking in all the stuff that was a part of the coal, for instance. So you have an exponential increase in pollutants. You have what some scientists are calling living in the middle of the sixth great extinction. We are at something like 1,000 times the natural background rate of the extinction of species, such that we have 44% reduction in reef corals, 41% reduction in amphibians, 38% reduction in trees, all of kind of by last year. And again, go back to the previous slide on stewardship. We have to pay attention to ecosystems. When we're disrupting other systems, it's going to impact everything. We also want to note that within those natural systems, the entire kind of the biomass of available kind of living animals, human beings now constitute about 1/3 of the biomass globally, and whereas most of the rest of the biomass of animals used to be wild animals, now that's down to around 4%, with something like 60% of the remaining biomass being livestock. Livestock's good. A lot of us like a good steak, right? But there are costs with it because the efficiencies of producing food, of meat for food, tends to have greater ramifications for the ecosystem in which those things eat. Most of our steaks don't come from grass-fed cows that wandered around in pretty green fields. They come from feedlots that have concentrated a lot of stuff, including some not so good stuff like hormones for growth, into that stuff, and have led to increasing numbers of environmental problems. Which means that when we're addressing the world we're moving into, we need to be thinking a lot about a lot of things all at once, which is complicated. To think about increasing temperatures and their consequences, to be thinking about increasing pollutants and their consequences, to be thinking about increasing extinction of species and their complications, to be thinking about the remaining species, how are they being treated and what are we using them for. Like, there's a lot going on. This is going to be the most depressing slide that I show, I think. There's some other depressing slides coming. I want to just name some of the impacts of climate change, and I'll note I was talking before that my own research and writing is looking at the implications of climate change and environmental degradation on war, the way that climate events make war more likely and make war worse. So here are some of the things, and once you kind of see some of the drivers or the impacts of climate change, you'll see how this works out, right? So heat waves in food-producing areas that make food harder to get at and use. Flooding in particular areas driven by changing storm systems. Sea level rise and its impact on infrastructure and populations. The majority of human beings live basically at sea level. If you rise the level of the seas 3 to 6 feet, it's going to have a cost. The U.S. Navy is deeply concerned about climate change because it has bases all over the world at sea level that have been built to kind of function at a certain level of stability of the sea level being at a certain rate. If that goes up 6, 8 feet, those bases become non-viable, and the U.S. has a cost that it bears with that, either having to move those bases or get rid of those bases and its impact. Water scarcity and drought and water stress for human beings and other systems. Wildfires, we're seeing greater rates of and sizes of wildfires. There was a real big fire several years ago in Canada in that tar sand producing, where they're producing oil out of it. Part of what made it so bad is that it hit populated areas and the houses of all these folks who worked there. It used to be we made houses out of wood, and wood burns at a certain kind of steady rate. So if a wildfire hit a house, the house burned at about the rate of kind of wood. But a lot of stuff in houses now is made of plastic, which comes from oil. So when these houses get hit, they don't kind of slowly turn to ash the way wood does. They go up like an oil drum, which increases heat, which makes the wildfire worse and increases costs. We're also seeing wildfires in increasing numbers of places, right? We had wildfires in Los Angeles this last year that cost billions of dollars. I have a colleague actually who just this week is moving back into the house that he had to leave with his family because of the wildfires. I have a former student who was the pastor at Palisades Presbyterian in Los Angeles, the Presbyterian church that burned down. Right? So wildfires, pollutants in our environmental systems, pollutants in our bodies, massive levels of migration. Right now, there are more people who are moving or being forced to move from one place to another than at any point in human history. We're guessing somewhere around like 145 million. Most in human history. Climate scientists and those who work on this stuff say, as climate continues to degrade, what we're looking for is an additional 200 million at least within the next decades. Loss of arable land, spread of diseases, right? It used to be the case that you could trust that some diseases would not get into certain parts of the world because the winters in those parts of the world were just too cold. But as things heat up a little bit, you get them in new areas. Some of those are like things like yellow fever that impact us. I'm from Colorado, kind of close into the mountains, and when I drive in the Colorado mountains anymore, I just see huge mountainsides of ponderosa pine that have been killed by pine beetle. The pine beetles have been around a long time. The pine beetles just didn't have the resources, and they faced kind of limits based on the natural system that as things have gotten warmer now, they can thrive. And so you're seeing huge swaths of Colorado wild country that are now full of dead ponderosa pine, which shifts from being a really nice place to hike to being another fire threat. Deforestation. Right now, I think the latest is we probably globally cut down the number of an area of trees roughly equal to the size of Indiana every year. Increasing storm size and frequency. Think back a decade, a little over, and think about Superstorm Sandy, right? a monster storm that hit all the way up into New Jersey and New York. And its implications, think about Helene last year. I have some good friends in Asheville who didn't think that hurricanes were their biggest concern. Well, now they're a concern. Loss of biodiversity and its impacts on agriculture, we started to name a little bit, and then vulnerability to disease and blights as we have more mega crops that we use that are more susceptible to particular things, right? So climate change just doesn't hit as an increase in temperature. It hits as having knockoff effects that are going to be, if anything, more destructive for us. I told you it was a depressing slide. And if you work on climate and violence, it's also a really interesting slide because you can see how any of these things make violence more likely. Part of what I want to signal here for you now is to recognize then that all of those things and climate change, right, rising temperatures, pollutants, decreased biodiversity, they impact us. They're impacting us now, they're going to impact us more going forward. So they're going to impact where we live, for instance. People are moving from some places to other places. Florida, I saw recently, it actually has a net negative migration right now because people are more concerned about the impacts of climate change in a state that sits very low to the ground. They're going to impact what type of products we buy. They're going to impact how we vacation, right? Colorado, I'm a skier. My dad was a ski patrolman when I was born. I would love to be on skis, but skiing gets harder when ski areas face more uncertain snow conditions and snowpacks. They're going to impact how we travel, what types of vehicles we use. They're going to impact where we work, who we work with, and the types of jobs that we have. They're going to impact the technologies that we use to do those jobs. They're going to impact the types of jobs. The fastest growing industries in the US right now are mostly related to renewable energy sources, right? Solar panel installation, wind turbine technician. They're going to impact healthcare. I have a colleague, a friend, who is the head ethicist at the University of Indiana Medical System. And Joe says, we know, we've done the studies to know that about 23% of the US health is attributable to the US healthcare industry. The remaining 77% has to do with genetics and where do you live and do you take care of yourself and that kind of stuff. So about 23%. We also know that the US healthcare industry is a major contributor toward greenhouse gases. If it were a country, it'd be the 13th largest emitter in the world. This happens in all kinds of ways. A lot of it is the single-use stuff, right? You don't ever reuse things. Some of it is some of the stuff that we don't reuse or use that others do. So for instance, when people use gas for anesthesia, that gas is a really potent greenhouse gas. In the US, to avoid contamination and lawsuit, any gas that gets left over in a tank, having been used in a single patient, gets vented into the atmosphere and becomes greenhouse gas. So Joe says, we know how big a contributor to greenhouse gases and pollutants the US healthcare industry is. We also know that there are health costs to climate change, right? Increased heat means more heat issues, heat concerns, heat costs. Increased pollutants in the atmosphere mean more asthma and disease. And Joe paused when he told me this next bit, and this still keeps me up at night. He said, Mark, here's the thing. At this point, if you weigh the benefits of the American healthcare industry, about 23% of our health is due to it, and the cost of the US healthcare industry because of climate issues, it's an open question as to whether the US healthcare industry is a net gain or a net loss in the US for healthcare. These issues shape how we vote. They shape how we engage in military and think about our own defense. Unstable systems make for unstable natural systems make for unstable political systems, make for increased likelihood of violence. They increase what we do with our stuff on the back end, right? We can never throw anything away anymore because there is no away to which places things go. They go someplace else, but they don't go away. They even impact how we think about our worship, and our worship lives with each other. Everything so climate change and environmental degradation hit every part of our lives, whether we're aware of it or not. What does stewardship look like now? Once you're aware that we're not talking about stable systems anymore. We're talking about a dynamic system that is getting worse and is going to get worse. We have baked in at this point 1.5 degrees Celsius increased temperature, which is going to have costs. We'd like to avoid 2 or 3, which could have catastrophic costs. Well, let's think about some things maybe that we could be doing as stewards during this time. The first is to begin by thinking about ourselves as stewards, and this goes back to last week, to remember that we are members of ecosystems. Because of that, we would never want to do something like, we're going to do thing that promotes our individual health or our species health as if our individual or species health wasn't connected to the health of other species and ecosystems. We do stewardship in groups, in communities, in ecosystems now. We would want to prioritize then systems that promote not just the survival of us or of a particular other species, but ecosystem survival, right? Prioritize those things that lead to healthy systems, which could come at individual expenses. Toward that end, build up the healthiest systems are those in which interdependency is recognized and promoted. So build up networks of interdependency, recognizing them and relying on them. This is a hard one for Americans, right? Independence is baked into our DNA. Autonomy is baked into our sense about how to live. So to promote interdependence rather than independence feels vaguely un-American. I don't think it has to. I think there's ways of thinking about dependence and interdependence and independence that are important for us. And then finally, work to limit environmental degradation and mitigate its impacts. This is what stewardship looks like for us going forward in the 21st century. Let me pause for a moment and ask if there's questions, reflections, or are y'all just like kind of now sitting in sad silence and wondering, what am I going to do?
Mark, this has just been terrific, if not not particularly enjoyable. But how do you respond to the person who says, wait, all of this change is just part of alternative circumstances through the ages, and God is still in control, it's not man-made?
So that's actually at least a couple of questions, right? So the first is to recognize, yes, over time systems change. We have known that. Climate scientists go back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years and watch a natural fluctuation in temperatures, right? We've had ice ages, mostly before human beings, had ice ages. We've had really warm periods all before human beings. We've had moderately warm periods during human beings. The flourishing of the Roman Empire was based partly on a particular warm period in the Mediterranean. The issue isn't the fluctuation. The issue is the rate of change and the driver of change. And at this instance, 99% of all climate scientists say it's not only changing faster than at any point that we've ever seen, but its change is due to human action. That's what anthropocentric or anthropogenic means, human caused. Now, there is still a remaining 1 or 2% of climate scientists who aren't sold on this yet. Of those, some of them just have said, like, I'm going to be agnostic on this. I don't want to pay too much attention to the mega. I pay attention to the minor. A couple of them work for the oil industry, and they're jobs turn on saying things like that. So the first thing is like, the science is in. This is settled. It is as settled as gravity. Second is that we can pay attention to other systems that are alert to this stuff, right? The United States military, which is not exactly a tree-hugging bunch, has been deeply concerned about climate change for decades now, and then writes into their quadrennial defense reviews and to their yearly and quarterly assessments the impacts of climate change on making their job more difficult, on being a threat multiplier. So the military is on the side of anthropogenic climate change. The markets are on this side. Just try and pay for insurance at a house in Florida compared to pay for insurance elsewhere, right? All the systems, all the peoples are in place on kind of saying it's real, it's rapid, it's dramatic, it's human caused. There are the outliers, but they don't have the data to support their position. So that's the first thing to say. The harder thing, which we don't want to lose sight of, is that somehow, as Reformed Christians, we do want to say something about, at the end of things, God is in charge. That it's not our job to make all of human history or all of the Earth's history come out right. We say that's bigger than we can handle, let's let God figure that out. This is a dominant theological claim we've been making for a long time. I want to continue to claim that. I do continue to claim that, but I want to continue to claim that with caveats like that doesn't mean that things are going to stay the same for us, and it doesn't look like perpetual progress until kind of things just keep getting better and better and better, because we don't have any evidence of kind of the way God works in history to think that that's how God works. We have plenty of evidence of God working in human history and in larger history of creation that looks like cost, that looks less like things getting better and more like death and resurrection. We're going to have to do some heavy theological lifting, which fortunately is what we've been doing for a while, to think about what it means for God somehow to be sovereign in this system. And there's some difficult questions we're going to take up, and I teach an entire semester-long course on that topic. Can't get it in the next couple of minutes.
I'm going to go, I think maybe for me, the next place in all that. Can we argue with the anti-science people that science is a study of creation? It's what we have, what we've been given. And why is that a bad thing? I mean, it seems to me, I would like to make that argument to people who act like, oh, science, they're lying, they've got bias, they've got all this other. I mean, it is a study of creation. It is a study of what is. Thoughts?
You can have those arguments. I've been in some of them. It's hard to know how forward they go because you're not agreed on what facts are. I don't know how to resolve that particular issue. I think it's less about arguing opposition into agreement and more about continuing to pray for discernment on the part of all parties and conversion among all of us. I'm as on board as just about anybody you'll find on the realities and their costs. Heck, I have a job that actually benefits from it because because ethicists only do stuff where things are really going bad, right? But I'm implicated. I'm one of those that is creating the problem. I'm using fancy technology that has carbon costs, that has metal costs. I'm getting into vehicles. I'm getting onto airplanes to go do talks about climate issues when airplanes are a huge emitter, right? So part of the way to get out from under the argument might be to recognize that that we're not wholly righteous going into it. Another part of it looks something like asking people not what they think is true, but what they want going forward. I think it's a better conversation when we ask, what kind of world do you want your grandchildren to live in? And how can we get there? Then, what do you think about the production of greenhouse gases? We started into politics here, and I want to kind of get into where things get really tricky and I get the most meddly. I already did that one, right? I want to talk about stewardship and politics for a moment. The Trump administration has been in office for just a little over 100 days, right? Among the executive orders that have come out of the executive office are aimed to revive the struggling coal industry and to halt jobs and stall projects related with renewables. It has included canceling grants aimed at protecting children from toxic chemicals in the EPA and mostly changing the task of the EPA and shutting good parts of it down. It has involved dismissing all authors working on climate issues for a major US study. It has involved eliminating scientific research in the EPA, but also in the NOAA and some of the major scientific bodies that think about climate change. And at the very beginning, it involved pulling us out of the Paris Accords, which are the primary global treaty for engaging climate issues. I don't know. If you're concerned about migration, I don't know how any of this makes that better. If you're concerned about the economy, I don't know how any of this makes that better. If you're concerned about public health, I don't know how any of this makes that better. If you're concerned about political stability, I don't know how any of this makes that better. I think these things do things that make it worse. I'm not here to defend a particular political party. I'm here to say that these particular actions are contrary even to the ends that they are being used to promote. I've had trouble coming up with an analogy for what this means. Maybe this is like a 2-pack-a-day smoker being told that they have, and then getting a second opinion that reinforces that they have stage 4 lung cancer. And the solution they come up with is they're going to shift from 2 packs a day to 3 packs a day. And then to decide to start smoking crack so that they won't be able to reason going forward after that. Again, I'm not trying to push a particular political perspective. I'm trying to say that the political perspective we all ought to have, if we care about displaced persons and dealing with them in a regulated way rather than in an unregulated way, which includes secure borders, has to include paying attention to climate impacts, right? We have to pay attention to all these things because all of these impacts all of these areas of life get exacerbated in the face of environmental degradation. And all of these impacts get worse in the face of environmental degradation. Maybe this is the worst slide. I'm going to say again, I'm not here to promote a particular political perspective. I grew up with staunch conservative parents that also had, and we also had solar heating we had solar panels on our roof because it was the most fiscally efficient way to heat our house. It was about economics, not about tree hugging, right? If you look at the circles of sustainability, the things that we need to do to promote sustainability for ourselves, the thing you will note here is that we do better at economics, politics, culture. If you look at that ecology side, though, you'd see we're in trouble. We can't get stability economically, we can't get stability politically, we can't get stability culturally if we're not getting stability environmentally. Which then leads to this complicated question: how should we relate our obligations to stewardship to the shaping of policies during politically dysfunctional times? If you can answer this question, please. I have my arguments, but I think a lot of it turns into what are the practices that we as individuals are going to take up going forward. That could mean, what will stewardship practices look like at Trinity Presbyterian Church? Y'all are, whether you are aware of it or not, a leader in this area among churches engaged in creation care. You've been thinking about it longer, you're promoting it more thoroughly than most churches in Greater Atlanta, including the other Presbyterian ones. So I find it really interesting that when I get on your website, I can't find any evidence in your description of yourself that you talk about it. What will it look like in the civic realm? What will it look like in the public realm? We're headed toward an end of the time, and I want to save some time for Q&A, but I want to suggest that there are actually some things you can be doing right now, right? So the first is to be aware that there are organizations that are faith-based, thinking about environmental issues that are really productive. You've worked with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, the leading environmental faith-based organization in the state of Georgia, one of the larger ones in the country that's doing magnificent stuff. Creation Justice Ministries is an organization based in DC that's doing really provocative and good stuff across denominational lines. The Presbyterian Church is doing important stuff. Mission Responsibility Through Investment Committee is the committee that helps us think as a denomination about where our investing agencies invest, and has built into it kind of attention to social and environmental factors. So within faith traditions, we have these organizations at work. You have secular organizations at work, the Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy. You have practical application projects at work. Project Drawdown is a plan to, I think that Paul Hawken is a little bit crazy thinking he's going to reduce global warming, but we can reduce the costs and reduce certainly emissions. Project Drawdown gives literally over 100 do this thing and they'll have an implication, and it includes a wide range of things like educate girls globally. The benefit globally is significant of that. Trinity Presbyterian Church could start a green revolving fund. The idea of a green revolving fund is you take a couple $1,000s, you put it into a fund and say, we're going to use this fund to pay for efficiencies that will reduce our costs and be of net benefit toward the environment. Okay? We're going to install new lighting systems that use less electricity. And we pay attention to how much money do we save from that. And we take that money that we save and put it back into the green revolving fund to fund the next thing. And because you do this over years, that fund grows. And as that fund grows, you can do more and bigger things. Agnes Scott College started a green revolving fund a decade ago. They have in the last decade halved their carbon cost through increased efficiencies, and their fund started with just a couple $1,000s. Right? There are a lot of really good things we can do to prevent the worst impacts and to mitigate the current ones that we're facing. All right. Finally, we just have to think about how we vote. I'm not telling you what party to vote for. I'm telling you to vote for your children and grandchildren's future. That just seems vital. All right, we got a couple minutes left for questions and therapy.
All right, great.
Mark, thank you for being here today and last week and for giving us a lot to think about. When I think about environmental justice, I think about concentric circles, starting with, Metro Atlanta, Georgia, the Southeast, the U.S., and so forth. And you had a bullet point several slides ago, I think it was the third bullet, that talked about interdependence. And so my question is, given that other countries, and in particular China, maybe India, are, by far the worst polluters, how can us, sitting here in Atlanta, be at all hopeful that they will reduce, their emissions going forward?
Great question, George. Thank you. I'm going to give you three answers. I'm going to give you the parent answer to that, the political answer to that, and the practical answer to that. The parent answer to that is just because they're doing it doesn't mean you have to do it too. I got told that. I assume most of you did, right? Do the thing that's right, regardless of what other people are doing, what other countries are doing. So that's the parent answer. The practical answer is to actually pay attention to what those other countries are also doing. China is simultaneously a huge emitter and the leading global producer of industry related to renewables. They're producing more solar in China by far than we are, and they're transitioning faster to solar than we are. It's just that because they have over 1 billion people, they're also producing more carbon than we are, right? Pay attention to everything else that they're doing, if we could actually hit the point of kind of shifting to renewables at the rate that China is, we'd be in a different place in the US and probably economically healthier. So that's the practical answer. The political answer is the only way that China feels greater pressure, India feels greater pressure to do more is if everybody, all the other countries, are invested in doing the same. Just like the only reason, as kind of your question implies, that the US may be doing stuff is if we see China doing stuff. Hence, international treaties, hence Paris, right? It's where everybody signs on and works that you get the most change. Some of that is because we actually care and want to bring about change. Some of that's because we don't want to be embarrassed when other people are in front of us and other countries are in front of us. So parent answer, political answer, practical answer. Other questions? Leave it to ministers.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm struck by that, as you say, we have to be aware of, to George's question, is what they say is you got where you are to where your tiny percentage of the population uses something like 80% of all the world's resources when you didn't have any industrial constraints or climate constraints or anything like that. Now that you're at the top of the hill, you're unfairly saying to the rest of us, oh, you can't do what we did. So we've got kind of an issue with that. But I would say in the political climate, I'd just say it looks to me like all the political economy options we're exploring are basically slightly different versions of highly extractive political economies that developed, at the beginning of the last century. So socialism, democratic capitalism, and communism all basically are arguing about how do we do best highly extractive, completely unsustainable economies. How do Christians step into that in a constructive way?
I want to suggest that there are two terms we need to be increasingly familiar with and that we need to center our work around. The first is repair, to recognize that repair is necessary, including historic repair, which, when you turn it into a noun, become reparations for harms that we have produced. Not that it's just about compensation for past, but that's about possibility for future. So there are really interesting projects at work now that think about reparations that are forward-looking rather than backward-looking that would help, for instance, underdeveloped countries achieve levels of prosperity that help stabilize them that don't come with the same levels of costs that we accrued through our actions. Which, to be fair, were kind of innocent, not attentive. We didn't think we would produce kind of carbon that would lead to the impacts that we have. That's partly, right? So repair. The other is complicity. I could make an argument, it'd be a really nerdy argument none of you would be interested in, that the history of modern ethics has been driven by the idea that we can or should either avoid or evade complicity. That's not a viable conversation going forward. We're always complicit. We are all complicit, no matter how hard we try to step out of it. So, as we develop attention to repair and recognize our complicity, it puts us in a different place to answer particular questions in new ways. The hard news is we've not been very good at thinking about either of these things. The better news is that the history of the church is centered on these things. You can't make sense of crucifixion and resurrection and God's ongoing work apart from repair. You cannot make sense of sin and its cost apart from complicity. We need to regain our first language, our rich theological language about how we live in the world before God with others, including non-human others. As we do that, we'll go a long way.
I just want to let everybody know that next week we will be gathering to discuss what we as Trinity members might take on in this arena. We haven't talked a lot about it in recent years, and we think it's really important to get started on this conversation, to restart this conversation. You have been incredibly helpful today. Thank you so much for this. This was really, I was hung up on the theology last week. I was online and I was like, I don't like theology. But I really appreciate your comments today.
A, you're welcome. B, go do it. It's exciting to hear that you have kind of some new energy for this. And C,
Mark, that was terrific. That's as good an hour as I've taken. And I appreciate you personalizing it. I know you probably make